All right, we're fixing to get started with Bible class. Vance is actually going to be teaching this morning. Against the elders' better judgment, they have asked me to take this class back over starting next Sunday. So I'm just giving you a week's heads up that you can go somewhere else. But I am going to be taking this class back over starting next Sunday. Before Vance got up, I kind of wanted to give everybody a heads up and kind of just a quick where my mind's at and where we're kind of leaning. And I'll explain more next Sunday. But Lord willing, we're going to start with the book of Ezra next Sunday. And my plan is to work Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. I'm really excited about Nehemiah. If we can get there, if y'all have been in my class before, I move a lot slower than AJ because I expect participation. And like me and AJ talked, with the minor prophets that we just finished up, it's kind of hard to get discussion going. But I'm hoping that with Ezra and especially Nehemiah, because there's a lot of leadership principles for us today that we can pull from Nehemiah. But that's kind of where I'm leading on Sunday mornings. When our summer series concludes on Wednesday nights, I'm probably going to veer off of the textual study, and on Wednesday nights we're going to look at heaven. We're going to look. Jeff May and Steve Klein did a book on heaven a few years back, and I'm kind of going to pull from that, and we're going to study about heaven on Wednesday nights. But I just want to let y'all know that's kind of where my mind's at right now. It's what our plan is to do starting next Sunday. I haven't decided yet if we're going to do questions yet with Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. But that's where we're at right now. So if nobody's in here next Sunday, that's all right too. All right.
Well, I don't have long. Hard to come up with something to teach that you got one shot at for a very few minutes, and that's it's not easy, but I'm going to try. I'm kind of picking up where AJ left off, but then he's going to back you up a little bit. But it's a good time. We hardly ever talk about that period of time between the Testaments. Hardly ever talk about that. It's an important period of time, of history. Some people say, well, that's not the Bible, so why would we study that? Well, there's a lot of Bible prophecy fulfilled during that period of time. Daniel chapter 11, Daniel chapter 2, a lot of Daniel's prophecies were fulfilled during that 400 years. And things about the leaders and the world empires that would come into being, all of that happened during that time. Daniel outlined it. So it's worth talking about. There's other reasons to talk about it. You know, when the Old Testament closed, well, not necessarily at the instant that it closed, but in the time of the Old Testament, Hebrew language was the language. The temple was the place where you went to worship. There were no such things as Pharisees and Sadducees, and definitely not Herodians or the Zealots, the Essenes, all of these that having a big part in the New Testament. You open the New Testament and it's a whole other world. They were under the Persian rule when the Old Testament closed. You open up the New Testament and they're under Roman rule. What happened? How'd you get there? Greek language is the main language. The synagogues, really the primary place of worship, and they were not existent when the Old Testament closed, but they're a big part of the New Testament. So I thought we'd look at some of that. Where did some of that originate? And look at the history. I like the history of it, but it's not enough time for most of the history. Let's start with the synagogue, because some people believe that did have its origins in the Old Testament. There is no clear indication of a synagogue in the Old Testament, but there are some hints that maybe things were headed that way. You know, I've heard of churches starting because somebody started having a Bible study in their home. And then it grew, and then it becomes so big that they had to get a building and start meeting to worship. That may be a description of how the synagogues came about. You read in Ezekiel chapter 8 and chapter 20, if you turn there, it was, of course, temples destroyed. No temple to go to anyway. But the elders would come into Ezekiel's house and meet. And some people say, well, that's the beginning of the synagogue. They started to assemble in other places and meet. But some people also say that's the start of the Sanhedrin, that could have been the start of that, a group of people coming together to meet. Either way, it didn't exist as such in the Old Testament, but it did in the New Testament. And, I've known this before, but it always amazes me to think that after the captivity, at no time since then to this present day, has there ever been a majority of the Jews living in Palestine. There's always been more Jewish people living outside of that area than in it. Well, there's only a temple in one place, and that's Jerusalem. So the need to have a place to assemble and worship in other places is kind of how the synagogue came to be. And they were very elaborate, nice buildings. I thought they were, I pictured a tent with concrete blocks and boards laid across them to sit on, but no, these were very nice buildings that they built. But that originated between the Testaments. I say it's a good reason to study that period of time, but we won't study anything that would show where they originated because there is no record of it, but we know it originated during that time. But we can see some of the reasons that, say, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and some of these people evolved and developed. There's a period of time at the close of the Old Testament for about 100 years that there's really no record of the Jewish people, of what their history or what they were going through or busy doing. It's just a kind of a dead period, I guess. But about that time, at the end of that period of time, we start to pick up on some things that really involve the Jewish people. As I said, the Persians ruled, and the next empire that Daniel talked about and that we read in history is the Greek Empire, Alexander the Great. The world, that's another thing different in the Old and New Testament. In the time of the Old Testament, the rule was to the east. You could always look to the east, Babylon and Persia and all that. You open up the New Testament, everything's ruled from the west, from Rome and from that area. But at the time Alexander the Great started, he started moving east, conquering that part of the world that was ruled by the east, by the Persians in the Far East. And the famous crossed the Hellespont in 334 BC, crossed over from Europe to Asia, modern-day city of Istanbul, Turkey, the only city that's on two continents, on Europe and Asia. But he crossed over and started to move along the north coast of the Mediterranean Sea across Asia Minor. Some notable battles took place, but as he turned south at the corner down into the area that today we'd call Palestine, it was Israel, it was Judah at the time, but he went all the way to Egypt. And he turned and started back. But on his way, I always thought this was fascinating history, but I didn't understand why. When he decided to conquer, he had to conquer Tyre. Tyre was an island city about a half a mile off the coast. And I used to wonder, I don't know why I didn't know this, but I wonder why did he want that city so bad? So bad that he spent 7 months, built a 600-foot wide, half a mile causeway from the mainland to the island to conquer it. It was the seaport for Persia, for their navy, for their ships. That's where he had to have it. I never did know that part until I studied this time. I always knew he did it. I just didn't know why. But that's why he had to have that particular place. But he comes back through, goes into Persia, and takes them on their own territory and conquers them. He controls the world. He was only a ruler for 10 to 12 maybe years, from age 22 to 32, and yet he's still considered one of the greatest military leaders in the history of the world. Amazing stuff. Bible talks about him. Can you imagine a man who could, just an ordinary man who could go and look at the Old Testament writings and say, that's me. He's talking about me. That's amazing to me to think about. But he was one person who could do that because Daniel talked about him. But anyway, his rule was short. He died. Chaos. Daniel talked about that. The kingdom being split. Daniel talks about it being split into 4 divisions, I think, and primarily it ended up in 3. And one of the rulers was the Ptolemies in Egypt. The others, the Seleucids, who had Babylon all the way back, Persia and Asia Minor. And then you had the Antipater, who ruled Macedonia and Greece. The ones that concerned the people of God were the 2 to the north and the south. The north, the Seleucids and Syria, and the south was the Ptolemies in Egypt. They fought to control that piece of land. That little piece of land was a buffer, I guess, against any enemy who happened to be to the north if you're Egypt, or to the south if you're Syria. So they fought. It wasn't so much over the people or anything. They just happened to be there, and they fought over that piece of land. Who would control it? For the 100 years after Alexander the Great, that promised land went back and forth 5 times, I think. It was under one and then the other. Generally, they were more at peace under the Ptolemies of Egypt. The Seleucids were a little more aggressive, and things were not so good. Things got really bad, as a matter of fact. Antiochus, I think it was, which one, the 3rd, when he tried to expand his kingdom, the enemy called on Rome. Rome was a rising power. Well, what he ended up doing is losing and having to pay money to Rome. And this had to continue on down through his successors. They all had to pay a tribute to Rome. Hard to come up with. The next Antiochus, by the way, you notice the connection cities of Antioch. There were 13 cities of Antioch during that period of time. And there are a lot of cities of Alexandria too. The most famous one, Alexandria of Egypt. Here's an aside. I thought it was funny. I had learned this a long time ago. You ever hear anybody talk about somebody being a smart aleck? That's smart Alexandrian. That's what that's short for. That's because they were the smart people. And that's where that comes from. I thought that was good. But anyway, a lot of cities named after these people. But this Alexander IV decided he'd get his money from Judah. Well, it just so happened there's a man there willing to pay him a tremendous amount of money if he could be the high priest. Now, he didn't fall into the lineage, but he knew there was great power there, so he paid him a lot of money. And he made an odd decision to send his tribute by another man who decided, this is a pretty good thing. I'll just pay him more and I'll get the job. So he got the job. Then there's fighting between them. That's when Antiochus Epiphanes IV come in and tried to, and this is when this was the darkest period, they say, in Israel's history, was when he came back and he put the hammer down. And he tried to destroy everything that was Jewish. And women would be put to death if they allowed their sons to be circumcised. They were not allowed, turned the temple into a temple of Olympus, I believe. It wasn't, there was it was a house of prostitution. It was, they offered pigs on the altar. They did everything against the Jewish people that they could. And as a result, eventually, of course, you can take only so much, and there's rebellion. And the rebellion, of course, come through the Maccabees. I was thinking, we tend to frown on those books because we understand they're not inspired. But neither is Josephus, but we respect him as a historian. Well, they were great historians too. And they should be respected as historians because a lot of this information comes from them. It comes from Josephus also, but a lot of it comes from them. And to tell you how bad it got when he came back, when Antiochus Epiphanes came back to squash this little rebellion, he killed randomly 80,000 people. And then he took another 80,000 captive. So it was bad. Those kinds of things will end up causing a revolt. And they did. And it didn't take a long time. We're talking now, we're down into the 190s to the 160s in this time frame of these things happening. But it ended up being started by Mattathias and then his 5 sons, and the most famous you recognize is Judas Maccabeus. But by 165, they had succeeded in taking Jerusalem back, and they had purified the sanctuary, resumed the sacrifices with a feast of dedication. That's another thing that didn't exist in the Old Testament, but it does in the New Testament. Anybody know where the mention of the Feast of Dedication is? Jesus actually went during the Feast of Dedication, John chapter 10. And these things I'm pointing out do beg for some questions here, but I'm not going to ask them yet. But anyway, the story, of course, it's also called the dedication of lights, I think. It's also called Hanukkah to this day. But that comes from the idea when they reestablished the temple, the miracle of the oil. They had a lamp, they had the oil, but they only had enough oil for one day. But it burned for 8 days, is the story, while they could acquire oil to keep it going after that. So that's what they call it. But and then they had a period of self-rule. They were, pretty much from the captivity on, they were ruled by somebody. But there was this period of time, about not quite 100 years, but a period of independence where the Jews were not under anybody until the Romans entered the picture, and then they were back under the thumb of another ruler. But that's the gist of the history, and then now we could try to tie in some of these other things, these things that didn't exist in the Old Testament. The synagogue was one. We mentioned that. Does anybody, I've written on this before, and it's not to cause controversy or anything, but do you find it interesting that the Jews went by the Old Testament law? Everything, just like we go by the Bible. We do what the Bible says. We try not to do more nor do less. That was their attitude, and yet here's something that didn't exist under the law of Moses, but it was widely accepted in the time of Jesus. He basically started his ministry in a synagogue, and it was a primary source of preaching the gospel. When Paul would go on missionary journeys, first place he'd go would be if there's a city that had enough Jews to have a synagogue, he'd go there, and that's where he'd start preaching. So it was heavily used to spread the gospel. It was accepted. Nowhere do you find anybody saying, hey, wait a minute, silence of the Scriptures. There was no synagogue in the Old Testament. We need to We can't endorse that. We got to. Isn't that interesting? I don't know the answer, by the way. I just find it interesting that they didn't make the same argument that we might. They still recognize the temple.
That's where the Jews were meeting. So if you want to the Jews, that's where you went.
That's right. And it's interesting. It's like a tool. They used it. And there was no message on whether or not they should be having it or shouldn't. Even Jesus grew up going to temple worship. It'd almost be like us establishing a separate building and organization, say for Bible classes, but keeping the church for the worship services. They did certain things in the temple, but they still did their sacrifices, and they still had their annual things recognized in the temple, but they did other things in the synagogue. That's interesting to me. Same with the Feast of Dedication. You got a Jewish calendar, and you got your holidays, and they're all laid out in the Old Testament. And you open the New Testament, and all of a sudden, what's this one? That wasn't on the Jewish calendar. That's not part of the Old Testament. They added it. They added to the Jewish calendar during the time. It's one reason we might not always think of this period of time as a period of silence. It's a period of silence in that there was no revealed word spoken, nothing written. But God was not silent. Clearly He was preparing the way for the gospel with the Greek language and things like that. But maybe He approved it. Maybe we just don't know that. But the Feast of Dedication didn't exist, wasn't on the Jewish calendar. But in John 10, they're celebrating the Feast of Dedication, and who goes? Jesus. Now, it don't say He approved, but it don't say He didn't. So that's interesting. These things interest me. I try to look at them and think about things like that. And the Greek language, Hebrew was the language. That's the language of the Old Testament. But they accepted the Greek language. And by the way, that process of shifting everything to a Greek way of life was Hellenization. There were Hellenizers in the New Testament, right? Many times, Acts 6, Acts 9, Acts 11, and probably many more places. But there were Hellenizers there too. And they would sometimes oppose them and go against them. But that push to accept this new way of life, this Greek way of life, that's called Hellenization. Alexander the Great was called the apostle of Hellenization. Well, that wasn't existing in the Old Testament, and yet everybody's speaking Greek. And by the way, not only did they speak Greek, but what was their primary version of the Old Testament? A Greek version, Septuagint. And that's interesting. All of these things changed, but they all seem to have had a place in the spread of the gospel. It's kind of like the Roman roads. They have played a big part in the spread of the gospel. But all of these things contribute to the spread of the gospel. As far as some of these sects go, in a negative way, sometimes we're compared to the Pharisees. In a positive way, maybe, I would say we should be compared to the Pharisees. Now, they had their bad traits, but they were opposed to all of this Hellenization. They didn't like that none, and they were trying to maintain the pure way of religion. Go back to the Bible. Go to the Old Testament. Let's do things. The priests should come from the line of Levi, and the kings, if there ever is one, should come from the line of David. And let's go by the Bible. So that wasn't a bad thing, but that's kind of how they developed. The Sadducees were a little more in line with the Greek way of life, and they were, we think of the Pharisees were. You hear these two words a lot, scribes and the Pharisees, scribes and the Pharisee. Well, they were closely associated. They're not just by accident they're mentioned together a lot, but the Pharisees depended on the scribes. You had to have an very accurate copy of the Word and study it in great detail. The only problem with the Pharisees, by the time they got through with their interpretations, and they're trying to be as strict as they possibly could. In the days of Jesus, what they taught and believed sometimes wasn't even close to what the Old Testament actually taught. They had changed, become so strict. They you know, if the Bible said keep the Sabbath holy, well, they could just really beef that up and make that even better. And we'll say you can't walk but so far, and you can't, you know, we'll have a whole list of things that you can and can't do on the Sabbath.
That's where, I guess during that period of time, is that where the Talmud and the Mishnah kind of evolved? The Talmud was a commentary on the Hebrew Bible, and then the Mishnah was a commentary on the Talmud.
I think I couldn't tell exact date, but yeah, it was definitely sometime in there, but I don't know the exact date of that.
What they were going about was commentary on the commentary.
That's the problem. You start going by a precedent. No, we do this because of a precedent, and you can finally come to so many interpretations of the precedent. You're so far away from the original that caused that precedent, but it's a little bit like telling the secret around the room. You know, by the time you get to the end, it don't resemble where you started. And the Sadducees were more closely aligned with the high priest. There was a little bit more of a political thing, and they were pretty much okay with Hellenization. In Hellenization, by the way, they said you could tell a city as soon as you went in it if it was a Greek city. The buildings, gymnasiums, and all of this stuff. It was just had a clear way of building and doing things. And the Sadducees, the high priest, those people were pretty much okay with that. Pharisees, not so much. And then you had another group mentioned in the New Testament, I believe the Herodians. They were big time in favor of it. They supported the government. And some people say it was probably out of fear. It's like if you're afraid, if you don't, they're going to come in here and kill 80,000 of you. So we're going to be all about this new government and this new way of life. And then you got the Zealots who were very opposed to the Herodians. And all of this developed because of Hellenization and the changes. And you know, the Hellenization, the Jews who lived the furthest from Jerusalem were generally the most Hellenized. They were the most Greek-like, and less so as you got into Jerusalem, but still it was a big effect even in Jerusalem. Let's see what others we've got here. The Essenes. The Essenes are not mentioned in the Bible, but it's kind of like some, like the Ptolemies and some of these people that are not in the Bible by name, but they play a big part in the story of the Bible. What part did the Essenes play? Dead Sea Scrolls. Somebody, yes, sir. Dead Sea Scrolls. They discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. I always was amazed at the one thing in the Dead. I've read about them, but I only remember really one thing that always amazed me. Book of Isaiah, the newest copy of Book of Isaiah was 1,000 years old before the Dead Sea Scrolls. And people would think, well, how could that be accurate? How do you know that's what Isaiah said? The only copy you got, that's 1,000 years from the time Isaiah wrote it. That's a long period of time. And then the Dead Sea Scrolls comes along and discovers copies within hundreds of years, 100 years, I think it was. And it was basically identical to the one that was 1,000 years out. So the one that's just amazing stuff. But good history, and it plays a part, and it brings up questions. There's always things that like I've always said, and what I have told people one of my favorite quotes is the guy that said, there's only two things that we should ever question, and that's things that have never been done this way before and things that have always been done this way before. Now, that's the only two things to question. So I know we're afraid to question things, but these things like the synagogue and the acceptance of it, the Feast of Dedication, recognize the rulers. Pharisees didn't exist in the Old Testament, but Jesus, he said, for the most part, you need to do what they say. Well, he's recognizing them as leaders. And he said, no, you don't necessarily want to do what they do, but for the most part, you can do what they say. They teach the law. So you got positions, you know, and it's not exactly like this, but I think, you know, things that come to my mind is like adding positions of leadership. Besides elders and deacons, maybe we got this and that. Well, that's kind of what they did. They had other positions of leadership, and they accepted them and recognized them as leaders. It's interesting to me, anyway. And it's odd, the people that held those offices that were so strict on keeping the Old Testament exactly as it was written, the office they held wasn't in the Old Testament, but they were the ones that were the strictest on keeping it. Anything else? Anybody? This is the only thing I could think of for a short, one time, 30 minutes. You got one shot at it, and it might be a year for them. Tony only asked me when there's a short notice. Sometimes no notice. He has done that, but so I don't know when or if I ever teach again. So I always have to try to find something that I can just shoot in here for 30 minutes and be done. Yes, sir.
Another thing that wasn't mentioned in the Old Testament, the idea of baptism. Coming from John, he starts baptizing. Where did that come from?
I wished I'd have thought to study that before we came. I have read that some ritual washings in the Old Testament was kind of evolved to baptism, but that's a good question.
John was baptized in preparation for the Lord.
And it seemed like everybody was pretty acceptant of that. All of a sudden, here's a guy out here wanting to put me in water, and they're good with that. That's a good question, good point. That'd be a good study, origin of baptism. And it's like you see it for the first time, and then nobody's questions it. It's like, well, yeah, oh yeah, we're good with that. Well, there's some history there. We need to know why they were good with that. That'd be a good one. If you want, I won't get onto that, but I love the study of baptism too, because you have things like the Bible specifically saying that John was baptizing for the remission of sins, and so was Christian baptism, and if they were baptized for remission of sins, then yeah, those are good studies. I always thought the studies of like Acts 19 when they rebaptized the people and the reason for it. I had some questions on rebaptism from my friend that I didn't realize his first Sunday he didn't come here with us. Ted that comes with me. He'd been coming since the second Sunday of May. I didn't realize he'd come that long with me. He started out to come every other week, and then he started coming every week at the second week of May. But anyway, he was asking me about rebaptism. I was telling him, sometimes it's a real thing. It's not really a rebaptism. It's like you realize when I got wet before, I was not baptized. I just got wet. But sometimes it's a real thing. You realize that you need to for that reason. And a lot of times it's not. It's a person that just don't remember how they felt. And I don't mean to make fun of the guy. He was an older guy, and he loved to argue. And his main way to win argument was saying, I've been a Christian 50 years, and I ought to know. And then he got rebaptized. And then next time he was arguing, he said, I've been a Christian 50 years. And I said, wait a minute, I thought you'd only been one for 2 weeks. But that's a good, fun subject. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.